Every day, thousands of Syrians risk their lives trying to flee the war that has ravaged their country for more than a decade. With more than 6 million Syrians seeking refuge in other nations, one of the most devastating humanitarian crises in modern history has unfolded. And one image, perhaps more than any other, has come to symbolize that crisis. In 2015, the body of a 3-year-old Syrian boy, Alan Kurdi, was found washed up on a Turkish beach. Alan, his mother and brother had drowned trying to reach Greece from Turkey. The image spread around the world, making the true desperation of the Syrian conflict visible.
Decade of civil war, intervention from multiple foreign countries has devastated Syria and has had a chilling effect upon its civilians.
Only the top 2% are living good life in Syria.
Life in Syria at the moment is really, really tough for ordinary people.
But what are the interests of foreign powers behind this war that has devastated the lives of Syrians?
The Syrian war can be seen as a war against the people, against their free will, against their vision to have the state that they envisage and they want themselves. And this is not a new war. This is a 100-years-old war.
Syria, a country home to fertile plains, high mountains and vast deserts. Nestled in Western Asia, the region is home to some of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. After decades of existence under a French mandate, in 1946, Syrian independence was internationally recognized under the government of Arab nationalist Shukri al-Quwatli. The following year, in 1947, the Ba'ath Party, the Arab Socialist Renaissance Party, was born. This was a secular political grouping steeped in the doctrine of pan-Arab socialist values. It coexisted in the 1940s with other political parties, such as the National Party, to which al-Quwatli belonged, and the Syrian National Socialist Party. In time, however, it would outgrow them all. During the first years of its independence, Syria seemed to be beginning a new democratic era, crowned by a new constitution. But it was short-lived.
That was beautiful. The sad part is it was only in power for 3 years, because very quickly Syria fell into an endless cycles of military coups.
In 1949, a coup d'etat put an end to the democratic government of Shukri al-Quwatli. For the next 2 decades, political instability would reign in the country.
Sadly, there was a lot of elite struggle during that period in Syria. One coup d'etat after the other. So we had 11 military coups in 21 years.
The Ba'ath Party had come to power initially in 1963, but in 1966, a left-leaning group, which Hafez al-Assad was part of, had taken power. And they had orchestrated quite a few radical left-wing policies, including land redistribution, nationalization of industry. And that was unpopular in many quarters. It was seen as too extreme and too fast. Certainly the most left-wing government that Syria had ever expected.
In need of a patron and protector, Ba'athist-led Syria sought to establish ties with new, hardline Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. The support was instantaneous. Moscow reached out to the Syrian government to strengthen the position of the USSR in the Middle East as a bulwark against US-backed Israel.
The Soviet Union indeed helped building the Syrian army, equipping, funding the Syrian army, and they tried to build it around the Red Army model.
The main beneficiary of this Soviet patronage was Syria's Minister of Defense, Hafez al-Assad. Throughout the 1960s, as tensions escalated within the Ba'ath Party, al-Assad was carefully positioning himself to take power when the time came. The tensions at the top of the party finally exploded at the beginning of the next decade.
In 1970, the two important men in Syria were Nuruddin Atassi, the Syrian president, and Salah Jdid, the deputy secretary of the Ba'ath Party. They had a very big fallout with Hafez Assad, who was back then the Minister of Defense, and with his chief of staff, Mustafa Tlass. Assad, although he didn't have the full control of the Ba'ath Party, he and Tlass had control of the army. So they launched a military coup d'etat against Nuruddin Atassi. They put him and Salah Jdid in prison with all their allies.
The rise of Hafez al-Assad marked the end of the Ba'ath Party's infighting and instability within the country. He would rule with an iron fist and establish a network of alliances within the army, his party, and the Syrian wealth creators that would allow him to remain in power for 3 decades. A strong opposition to his secular rule began to emerge in the shape of the Muslim Brotherhood, a radical Islamic fundamentalist movement with origins in Egypt, which determined to take a stand against apostate secular regimes in the region. In 1976, they took up arms against Assad.
They launched a series of events, what they call the Muslim Brotherhood Uprising. And these operations were, of course, met by violence by the Syrian regime, and violence was used by both sides against civilians and against armed factions. And the epicenter of this was in the city of Hama. That was culminated with the massacre of Hama in 1982.
A massacre of 10 to 20,000 people, which very much was the moment of shift under Hafez al-Assad. After this point, a much darker Hafez al-Assad regime emerged, one where everyone was very aware that if you step out of line, you could be killed, your family could be killed, you could be detained, life won't be worth living.
The regime interrogated those they thought were behind the Brotherhood's attacks. But despite some people falsely admitting their guilt to try and save their families, Assad's men would not spare their lives and invariably executed entire families as a warning to any who dared to challenge the regime.
My grandmother was watching. She saw all of this with her daughter-in-law and all the other women in the family. And at the end, they just killed them all. So my grandmother was watching her husband, her 2 sons, her other relatives just being shot at. And they were all screaming, collapsing, but there's nothing they could do. And they were not the only ones. There were so many other who just died because the regime couldn't take the idea that someone could say no.
Having brutally suppressed the Muslim Brotherhood in 1980, to further cement its hold on power and ensure a supply of armaments, the al-Assad government signed a treaty of friendship and cooperation with the USSR, further strengthening its ties with the communist giant. As long as it had the patronage of the Soviet Union, al-Assad could keep his power base together. But in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell, and Assad spied an opportunity. He began to pivot towards new friends in the West.
He saw the wind of change blowing, and he knew the Soviet Union is going to collapse. So he started turning to the West, and indeed the Gulf War was the opportunity.
Supporting the Americans and sending troops to fight alongside them in the 1991 Gulf War would help the Syrian government improve its relations with Washington. But it would be Hafez al-Assad's last roll of the dice. With the arrival of a new millennium, a new era began in Syria. On the 10th of June 2000, at the age of 69, Hafez al-Assad died. A month later, Bashar al-Assad, the dictator's third son, took over the Syrian leadership. He was the sole candidate in the election. It was a coronation rather than anything remotely resembling a democratic process, but many onlookers were surprised that the softly spoken third son had supplanted his older brother and uncle to become his father's heir. Bashar had studied in Damascus and, in his 20s, went to London to specialize in ophthalmology. After the death of his eldest brother, Basil, in a car accident in 1994, Bashar came back to his country and started a military and political career. The international community believed that the new president would break from his father's authoritarian tradition. He was young, educated, and had close ties with the West, due partly to his studies there and partly due to his Anglo-Syrian wife, Asma, whom he met in London and married shortly after taking office. But those hoping for a more liberal and enlightened regime in Syria were to be disappointed. The government of Bashar al-Assad repressed all activism for political reform.
That was because of the realities of the old guard still being in power. All his father's main people were still there, and they all advised him against it. And he came to realize that maybe their approach was better.
Following his father's example, Bashar al-Assad tightened relations with Russia and Iran, countries that would help guarantee his permanence in power a decade later. Tunis, December 2010. A young fruit seller sets himself on fire in protest at the confiscation of his goods and mistreatment by the authorities. His death sparked a wave of demonstrations that led Tunisian dictator Zine El Abidine Ben Ali to resign in January 2011. The protests would ignite the fire of freedom in other Arab nations, and in February, longtime Egyptian dictator Hosni Mubarak was forced to resign. Demonstrations spread against the governments of Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen and Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. The Arab Spring had begun, and the Syrian government was waiting for it to arrive on her shores. Secret Syrian government documents, leaked through a former senior official, confirm that al-Assad had a strategy ready to deal with the protesters.
What these documents reveal is that the regime's plan was to meet protests head-on with force, with the aim to disperse the crowds and prevent the sort of fate that Assad had witnessed occur to his fellow strongmen in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya.
By the time the protests arrived, al-Assad knew what their tactics would be and from whence the threat would come. Al-Assad gave orders to crush the demonstrations and prevent them from reaching Damascus at all costs. But whilst initially successful, this crackdown would not entirely extinguish the flames of revolution.
Eventually, all of this led to very genuine, spontaneous series of uprisings in Syria in March 2011. They started in Daraa, Then Homs echoed that, and then other Syrian cities. And then in April, they called for the Jum'at al-Ghadab, the Friday of anger.
I was in the country when the first deaths were announced, and I remember thinking, my goodness, that's the turning point. Each week that went by, more and more people were shot just for peacefully protesting because the regime was frightened, and the only way it knew how to react was to squash it.
Assad was determined to meet fire with fire and to deploy military force at the least excuse or provocation. The killing of demonstrators sparked the desertion of many members of the armed forces, who together with mercenaries and other rebel groups formed the Free Syrian Army. Their main objective was to overthrow al-Assad, and they were well supported by allies in the region and further afield. The Free Syrian Army began training in Istanbul, the base of the Syrian opposition in exile, and was advised by Turkey, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Qatar.
In August 2011, a lot of Western leaders, most importantly Obama, Cameron, the French president, the German, the head of EU, all of them, including with the Saudi king, in one day, in an orchestrated move, they came out and said, Assad lost legitimacy, he should step down.
But Bashar al-Assad's government had a powerful ally, eager to flex his muscles and to contest American influence in the region.
Bashar Assad turned to the historical ally, to Russia, and this time they found great opportunity to have a strong comeback to the Middle East, to institutions they built. They knew more than anyone else. It was their territory. They considered Syria as their territory, the country that was built alongside their model. And of course, they didn't want this model to be defeated or to collapse.
They were unwilling to see their man in Syria overthrown. Syria is a major purchaser of Russian arms. It's also a key anti-American ally, but particularly important for the Russians is the strategic placement of the Tartus naval base, which is Russia's only Mediterranean port and the home of the Black Sea Fleet.
In its efforts to crush the Free Syrian Army, the Syrian regime was also supported by Iran and Hezbollah.
There are key geopolitical reasons for Iran to want the Assad regime to remain in power in Syria. Iran has a major regional rivalry with Israel. It has supported the creation of Hezbollah in Lebanon since the 1980s, and it uses Hezbollah to pressure Israel militarily by launching attacks on Israel. Hezbollah gets its rockets and its weaponries from Iran through Syria. So losing Syria from that supply line would be absolutely catastrophic for Iran's relationship with Hezbollah and by extension its ability to put pressure on Israel.
Military support for the al-Assad regime meant that by February 2012, the death toll in the conflict had exceeded 7,500 civilians and continued rising.
Foreign powers became involved in the Syrian civil war because, in the West at least, they wanted to support moderate rebels in their fight against President al-Assad. But when it came down to the broader intentions in the area, then you start to see that a proxy war emerges. The Russians and the Iranians on one side supporting Assad, and on the other you have the Turkish, the Israelis, and the US and their coalition, which are seeking to try and stop that Russian and Iranian interference in the area.
With armed opposition groups multiplying throughout Syria, and foreign powers becoming more involved in the conflict, Bashar al-Assad was facing his toughest challenge yet. By the second half of 2012, several of Syria's main cities were under siege, and Assad's regime was under ever greater pressure. Advancing inch by inch, some opposition factions managed to take part of Aleppo, the second most important city in the country, and by far their biggest strategic gain yet, if they could hold it.
It looked like they were going to be very successful. However, they were a newly formed group. They did not plan as effectively for capturing the whole city, and pretty quickly their lines of supply ran out and they weren't able to complete the conquest.
The more territory the opposition gained, the more divided they became. Lacking a unified leadership or sense of common purpose, opposition forces stalled.
As that infighting grew and the outside world started to see the splintering and the fragmenting as well, then other funding evaporated, and that of course left no effective opposition to the Assad regime.
In the meantime, the Assad regime fought back, and they fought the rebels to a standstill. Effectively, what happened at that point was the city of Aleppo was divided.
At this critical juncture, another force entered the fray. Known for its divisiveness and brutality, which was every bit as dangerous to the opposition as it was to the Syrian dictatorship. ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, was a branch of Al-Qaeda born in Iraq.
It's very important to understand that only 0.09% of the Syrian population joined ISIS. ISIS has nothing to do with Syria. It's just grown there as the perfect environment for, like a germ put into a dish of ajar jelly, the perfect environment in which to multiply. And it's used Syria as that perfect environment, the lawless vacuum that it needed to get started.
In 2011, with opposition forces advancing on all fronts, Bashar al-Assad made a highly dangerous and deeply divisive decision. Into this cauldron of military conflict, he released jihadist prisoners from Syrian jails to play a destabilizing role against the opposition forces.
Bashar al-Assad released these people knowing that they would cause a bit of dissension and that would feed his narrative of, oh, all these opposition people are terrorists. But I think even he never dreamt that they would go on to form the monster that became ISIS. Nobody foresaw what would become.
According to US intelligence, ISIS had around 5,000 militants by 2013, many of them foreigners.
The organization chose Raqqa as their capital, an area considered by many to be a provincial backwater in the country, but which, in fact, was a vital strategic resource hub.
ISIS, by sitting there in Raqqa on the Euphrates River, that gave it control of the entire water network of Syria with the Assad Dam and all the hydroelectric power that came with that. So they had a kind of stranglehold. And Syria's oil and gas fields are in that part of the country as well, so they could put a stranglehold on that, which is how they then started to sell the regime's own oil and gas to the regime because they controlled it all.
The agricultural wealth of that part of the country meant ISIS had a monopoly on wheat production too. Unable to feed its population, the Assad regime had to turn to Russia for large quantities of bread and wheat, which took a further toll on its resources. With its grip on the country's resources and allegiance to no one but itself, ISIS became the enemy of all sides. But for the moment, they were not Assad's main concern. Instead, he continued to take the fight to the moderate opposition groups in central and northern Syria.
It did make sense to actually leave the radical Islamists alone for a while, whilst he was taking on the more moderate forces, because that would justify his narrative. If he could get rid of the more moderate forces and the only people that were left were these radical Islamists, then he did have proof that actually he was fighting a radical Islamist jihadist organisation. So ISIS did certainly serve a purpose for him.
With most of the country devastated, the economy destroyed, poverty widespread, and in the midst of a wave of violence, the likes of which they'd never seen before, the Syrians still had yet to face their worst nightmare.
On the 21st of August 2013, Ghouta, an area near Damascus controlled by the opposition, was attacked by government forces with sarin gas.
At least 1,400 people were killed, many of them civilians rather than rebel fighters, including many children. When this happened, fingers immediately pointed to Assad, and everyone said, this must be Assad who has done this, he's the one that has the chemical weapons.
Assad never acknowledged responsibility for the attacks and continued to blame the opposition. The attack gave the governments of the United States, France, and the United Kingdom the perfect pretext to intervene in the conflict. For President Obama in particular, there was every reason to get involved in the conflict, to demonstrate the effectiveness of his much-praised humanitarian foreign policy.
I've spoken to the leaders of two of our closest allies, France and the United Kingdom, and we will work together in consultation with Russia and China to put forward a resolution at the UN Security Council requiring Assad to give up his chemical weapons and to ultimately destroy them under international control.
First is that there is an international prohibition on the use of chemical weapons. They are an illegal weapon of war, and therefore any employment of them is in itself a war crime. Secondly, however, they triggered a particular national security response from the United States, known as the 3 T's nexus, a term coined by Bill Clinton's national security advisor, Anthony Lake, in the 1990s. The 3 T's are terrorists, tyrants, and technology. And the idea that once you have a tyrant unbound by international law and the will of his people, in control of the technology of weapons of mass destruction, in an area where non-state terrorists are functioning, the ultimate fear of the United States is that that tyrant might provide that technology to those terrorists.
The senseless slaughter of hundreds of innocent civilians through the use of expressly prohibited chemical weapons should have been more than sufficient to incite a major military intervention by the West. Ultimately, however, despite the tough talk and moral outrage, America and the West were found wanting.
They weren't going to repeat those same mistakes as they saw it of getting involved in Afghanistan and Iraq.
Instead, without a UN resolution in place or even the approval of the US Congress, Obama was forced to fall back on covert interference by his intelligence agencies and military to try and achieve his aims and topple the Assad regime. The US put in place a clandestine CIA effort codenamed Timber Sycamore.
Timber Sycamore was a multi-billion-dollar CIA Pentagon operation under the Obama administration aimed at the vetting and arming and deployment of rebels to fight both the Assad regime and also to combat the spread of ISIS that was moving across the border from Iraq and capturing large swathes of territory in Syria.
Timber Sycamore was approved by President Obama in 2013. This involved the supply of funds, of weapons, and of training for those forces so they can continue to battle and take on Assad.
But the problem was how to identify which groups within the Free Syrian Army deserved support, and it was a genuinely difficult problem to work out.
With chemical disarmament unresolved, tensions between the United States and Russia escalating, and no suitable alternative to the Syrian government in sight, in September 2013, it was Vladimir Putin who would make the first move to try and defuse the situation.
What then happened was a slightly controversial affair whereby a deal was cut between Russia and America, whereby rather than Assad be attacked as a punishment for using these chemical weapons, he would agree under Russian supervision to give up his chemical weapons arsenal in exchange for America not attacking him.
For Obama, this was a potentially ideal face-saving solution. It meant that he could claim a win without having had to intervene militarily. For the oppressed Syrian peoples and their supporters in the region, however, it was an unmitigated disaster.
For the other regional powers involved, it changed their calculus of what was happening in Syria. For a lot of countries like Turkey and Qatar and Saudi Arabia, who for a long time had supported the anti-Assad opposition on the presumption that eventually America would come in to topple Assad in the same way they had toppled Gaddafi in Libya and Saddam Hussein in Iraq, they realized actually the Americans weren't going to come. And that changed their approach. They began supporting slightly more radical groups, for example, because they hadn't supported them before because they knew the Americans wouldn't like them.
Whilst the violence in Syria was escalating day by day, Putin and the Russians now had the green light to funnel arms and support to Assad to their heart's content. The fate of the Syrian opposition and the Free Syrian Army was now sealed. Assad had what he wanted, for now. But he still had ISIS to deal with.
In June 2014, ISIS declared itself a caliphate. Putin's Russia had helped Assad destroy the moderate opposition, but he now needed new allies to drive out the Islamic extremists, and he found them.
3 months later, in September 2014, the United States and a coalition of Arab countries came to the rescue of Assad and began a bombing campaign against their common enemy, the Islamic State.
In May 2015, ISIS outraged the entire world as it seized the historic Syrian city of Palmyra.
The world watched the cold-blooded execution of more than 300 people and the destruction of the city's priceless cultural heritage. As a consequence, another foreign power entered the conflict militarily, the United Kingdom.
The UK's official involvement in the Syrian war is known as Operation Shader. And on paper, this involves logistical support for American forces and other NATO allies, as well as airstrikes conducted by typhoons and tornadoes, and remote drone strikes using the RAF's Reaper drones. In addition to this covertly, British Special Forces have been operating on the ground in Syria, but have also been tracking down jihadi networks and arms exchanges between the likes of Libya and Tunisia as well.
For the first time in history, a British Prime Minister officially authorized the killing of British citizens on foreign soil. These were British citizens who had chosen to fight for the Islamic State.
The official reason given for the strike was to preempt a terrorist attack that the two individuals, both known members of ISIS, were trying to orchestrate remotely in British territory. The controversy comes from the fact that at that point, Britain was officially at war in Iraq, but not in Syria. The problem with this method is that it lacks transparency, it is on the fringes of legality, and it also locks a country into a cycle of violence where suspected threats emerge and lethal force is used to nullify that. It's essentially a whack-a-mole game that has no clear end.
The open involvement of foreign powers in the Syrian conflict and the dangerous advance of ISIS in the country intensified the fighting between the remaining factions. After more than 4 years of civil war, Syrians still saw no hope of peace, and the West's failure to act decisively had played into Assad's hands.
In 2015, following the ISIS siege and massacre at Palmyra, Russia decided to re-engage in the Syrian conflict.
Her munitions and support had helped Assad gain ground in the fight against the moderate opposition and the Free Syrian Army. But Putin had been happy to let America and the West take the lead in the fight against ISIS. Now, however, he decided the moment was right to re-enter the fray to ensure Russia's post-war influence in the region. He ordered airstrikes on opposition-held areas, and despite having publicly pledged not to put boots on the ground, the Russians instead sponsored mercenary groups to go and fight alongside Assad's forces and Hezbollah.
The Wagner Group are not quite your textbook military contractors or private military contractors, PMCs. PMCs are all about doing a nation-state's bidding for them and being brought in to perhaps help with some behind-the-scenes and logistics work, or in some cases to take on a frontline fight. But when it comes down to the Wagner Group, well, you start to see how directly linked they are to the Russian state, to Russian intelligence, and to the fulfillment of Russian national security objectives. Put simply, wherever you see the Wagner Group, you see Russian state interests.
The retrieval of Palmyra from ISIS and Syrian government forces
In March 2016,
assisted by the Wagner Group and Russian airstrikes, turned the eyes of the world onto Putin as he staged an extraordinary and flagrant demonstration of Russian influence in the region.
And from that moment, he really succeeded, Putin, in taking charge of the Syrian narrative. And he was seen at that stage, obviously by Bashar al-Assad in particular, as the savior of Syria.
with Russian help, the Assad regime was regaining nearly all its lost territory and consolidating its control over most of the country. And in doing so, they managed to relegate America and the West to bit-part players who had been suckered in to fight ISIS and the Islamic extremists whom Assad had released from his own prisons. Obama and the West had been well and truly played by Putin and Assad. In Aleppo, the fighting went on for years.
At one point, it did look as if the rebels were going to be successful. At the points when the Assad regime was at its weakest in 2013, 2014, the rebels did make a push to capture all of Aleppo and including the western half. And for a long time, the western half was effectively cut off from the rest of Assad-controlled Syria. But eventually, the tide was turned, and ultimately, Assad was able to recapture all of Aleppo and expel the rebels from the eastern half. And this was done with considerable help from the outside, from Russia, from Iran, and from the Lebanese militia Hezbollah. And by the end of 2016, all of Aleppo was recaptured by the Assad regime.
By the time the fighting finally ended, the country's previously second-largest city and economic heartbeat lay in ruins, with more than 35,000 buildings destroyed.
After Obama's departure from power at the beginning of 2017, the new US President Donald Trump announced the cancellation of the covert program in Syria implemented by his predecessor.
He declared that the main US objective, defeating the Islamic State, had been achieved, and that it was now time to retreat and leave the country to rebuild itself.
In 2018, Washington's new stance on Syria and Russian support for al-Assad allowed the regime to recapture Damascus and its strategic suburbs for the first time in 7 years.
Even without having neutralized the opposition entirely, the Assad regime is trying to make a start on the country's reconstruction, a titanic task in an impoverished country which lies in ruins and whose spirit is broken. Despite the aid offered by the international community, Syria still does not have enough resources to recover after more than 10 years of war. The fighting has displaced more than 6 million people internally, and another 6 million, a third of whom at least are children, have moved to neighboring countries where they live in camps in precarious conditions.
Syria has been, if you like, a refuge state where so many people, other people, have come to find sanctuary in Syria. And it's one of those awful ironies of history that now Syria finds itself, half the population displaced and so many refugees forced out and regarded as a pariah state.
The crimes and horrors of the Assad regime have resulted in a humanitarian disaster of an unimaginable scale. The pain and suffering of the Syrians continues unabated to this day.
And even after all the horrors the Syrian people have endured, they are left with the same political dictatorship that they had when the war started.
Right now, we have nothing. We have absolutely nothing. The economy is in ruins. There is no electricity. Most families, including upper middle class, can't even put bread on the table for their children. So there is daily permanent suffering. There isn't one place to escape.
Over half the population displaced, a third of the housing stock destroyed, 90% of the population below the poverty line. It was not as bad as that before the revolution.
Strategically and tactically, the other nations that were involved have achieved their goals. Russia has maintained its Mediterranean naval base. The United States dismantled the core territory of the ISIS organization. Although it still exists there, it no longer has a clear safe haven from which it can regularly project attacks. Iran was able to ensure that its ally Syria did not become a pro-American democracy. And Hezbollah was able to train and recruit additional recruits and prepare itself for further conflict with Israel. Ultimately, however, caught in the midst of this are the people of Syria, who have suffered and will continue to suffer at the costs of these other nations' gains.
The society is just very weak. A very weak society means very, very little hope for a better future.